There is a moment that happens right before every great breakthrough in history, and almost nobody talks about it. It is not the moment of the discovery itself. It is not the flash of insight that shows up in the history books. It is the moment right before that, the quiet moment, where someone looks at a problem that has stumped everyone else and decides to think about it differently. Not harder, differently. That single decision to change the angle of attack rather than the amount of effort is the real difference between people who solve problems and people who stay stuck in front of them. We have been taught to believe that genius is something you are born with, a number on a test, a gift handed out at birth to a lucky few, while the rest of us are left to grind through life, solving problems the slow, painful way. But that belief is not just wrong, it is dangerous, because it gives you permission to stop trying. If genius is a gift you either have or don't, then there is nothing to build, nothing to train, nothing to improve. You simply are what you are. But what if that entire premise is false? What if the people history remembers as geniuses were not working with a different brain than yours, but with a different set of tools? What if the real secret was never raw intelligence, but a small collection of thinking patterns, mental models, that let you cut through confusion, complexity, and noise, and arrive at the right answer faster than everyone else in the room? That is exactly what this is about. Not IQ, not talent, decision architecture. The invisible scaffolding that the sharpest minds in history have used to take apart impossible problems and rebuild them into something solvable. Some of these models come from physics, some come from psychology, some come from the boardrooms of the world's most successful founders and investors. But every single one of them shares the same purpose. They give you a shortcut through complexity, a way to see clearly when everyone else is confused, and a way to make high-quality decisions even when you don't have all the information. Here is why this matters right now, more than at any other point in history. We are drowning in information. You have access to more facts, more data, more opinions than any generation that has ever lived. And yet somehow, decision-making has not gotten easier. It has gotten harder. Because information is not the same thing as understanding. You can have every fact in the world at your fingertips and still make the wrong choice. Because facts without a framework are just noise. Mental models are the framework. They are the filters that turn raw information into clear decisions. And once you have a stocked toolkit of them in your mind, something remarkable happens. Problems that used to take you days to untangle start resolving themselves in minutes. Situations that used to overwhelm you start to look almost simple, because you are no longer seeing the surface of the problem. You are seeing its structure. By the time you finish this, you will have 15 of the most powerful thinking tools ever discovered. Tools used by physicists, investors, founders, and strategists to make decisions under pressure, cut through confusion, and see what other people miss entirely. You will learn how to break any problem down to its bare foundations and rebuild it from scratch. You will learn how to solve forward problems by working backward from failure. You will learn how to find the simplest explanation buried underneath a mountain of complexity. You will learn how to see 2, 3, 4 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. And you will learn how to stop mistaking your model of reality for reality itself, which is one of the most quietly destructive mistakes a human mind can make. This is not trivia. This is not a list of clever quotes to repeat at dinner parties. Every model in here is meant to be used today on a real problem in your real life. Some of them will change how you make decisions at work. Some of them will change how you handle conflict, or risk, or uncertainty. Some of them will simply give you the quiet, grounded confidence of knowing that no matter what problem shows up in front of you, you have a way to think your way through it. So here is the uncomfortable truth before we begin. Most people will hear these ideas, nod along, feel a small spark of recognition, and then go right back to thinking the exact same way they always have. They will not install these models into how they actually operate. They will treat this like entertainment instead of training. And 6 months from now, they will be facing the exact same kinds of problems, making the exact same kinds of mistakes, wondering why nothing in their life has gotten any clearer. You do not have to be one of them. The tools in here work, but only if you actually pick them up and use them. Genius was never a gift. It is a set of habits. Let's build them. Chapter 1. First Principles Thinking. How to rebuild any problem from zero. In the early days of one of the most ambitious companies ever built, a young entrepreneur ran into a wall that should have ended the entire venture before it began. He wanted to build rockets, but every quote he received from existing aerospace manufacturers came back at a price so high it made the entire mission mathematically impossible. By the conventional way of thinking, the case was closed. Rockets were expensive because rockets had always been expensive. That was simply the price of admission to space. Most people would have accepted that answer and walked away. He did not. Instead, he asked a different kind of question, one that almost nobody in the industry had bothered to ask in decades. Not, what do rockets cost? But, what are rockets actually made of? And what do those raw materials cost on the open market? He broke the rocket down to aluminum, titanium, copper, carbon fiber, and other raw materials, priced them individually, and discovered that the raw material cost was only a small fraction, something like 2%, of what manufacturers were charging for a finished rocket. The gap between that 2% and the market price was not physics. It was not chemistry. It was bloated tradition, inefficient manufacturing, and an industry that had never been forced to question its own assumptions. That single realization became the foundation for a company that would go on to reshape the entire space industry. That is the power of first principles thinking. And it is arguably the single most important mental model on this entire list. Here is what most people do when they face a hard problem. They reason by analogy. They look at what has been done before, what other people are doing, what the accepted wisdom says, and they build their solution on top of that foundation. This is fast, and most of the time it is perfectly fine, because most problems do not require you to reinvent anything. You can simply copy what already works. But when you are facing a genuinely hard problem, a problem where the existing solutions all seem to hit the same wall, reasoning by analogy will trap you inside that wall forever. You will keep making small variations on the same failed approach because you never questioned the approach itself. First principles thinking works differently. It asks you to strip a problem down to its most basic, fundamental truths. The things you know to be true beyond any reasonable doubt, and then rebuild your solution up from that bare foundation ignoring everything that everyone else assumes must be true. It is essentially the difference between building with borrowed bricks and firing your own clay. Slower at first, but the resulting structure is entirely your own, and it is not limited by anyone else's assumptions about what is possible. Here is how you actually apply this the next time you are stuck on a hard problem. Step 1. Identify and question every assumption. Write down everything you currently believe about the problem, every constraint, every rule, every reason you think something cannot be done. Then go through that list one item at a time and ask, is this actually true? Or is this simply how it has always been done? You will be shocked how many of your hardest constraints turn out to be habits dressed up as facts. Step 2. Break the problem down to its fundamental components, the pieces that are true, regardless of industry convention, historical precedent, or common opinion. In the rocket example, that meant raw materials and basic physics. In your life, it might mean the actual numbers behind a financial decision or the actual psychological needs behind a relationship conflict, stripped of every story you have layered on top. Step 3. Rebuild from the ground up. Once you know what is actually unquestionably true, start reconstructing your solution, using only those foundational truths, without reintroducing the assumptions you just tore down. Allow yourself to arrive at conclusions that look strange or unconventional, because unconventional is often exactly what a first principles solution looks like from the outside. This model is uncomfortable to use because it is slow, and it forces you to admit that things you have believed for years might simply be inherited assumptions rather than truths. But this discomfort is precisely the price of genuine originality. Every industry, every field, every stubborn personal problem is full of invisible rules that everyone follows simply because everyone else follows them. The moment you learn to see those rules as questions instead of facts, you gain access to solutions that are completely invisible to anyone still reasoning by analogy. Consider how this plays out somewhere far removed from rockets and factories, inside something as ordinary as a household budget. Most people, when they feel financially stretched, reason by analogy. They look at what everyone around them is doing, cutting the occasional coffee purchase, trimming a subscription here or there, and they assume that is simply what financial discipline looks like, because that is the accepted script everyone else seems to follow. A first principles thinker approaches the exact same problem completely differently. They ask, what are the actual, unavoidable costs of staying alive and functioning? And what is genuinely optional? They price out shelter, food, transportation, and essential obligations from scratch. The way an engineer prices raw materials, rather than accepting the inherited assumption that a certain lifestyle is simply required. Very often, this bare-bones rebuild reveals that entire categories of spending considered normal and untouchable are, in fact, optional additions layered on top of a much smaller true baseline, exactly the way that inflated rocket prices were layered on top of a much smaller raw material cost. This is also why first principles thinking tends to make people around you uncomfortable, at least at first. When you stop accepting inherited assumptions, your conclusions will occasionally look strange, even reckless, to people who are still reasoning entirely by analogy. They will ask why you are doing something differently than everyone else. And the honest answer, because I traced the problem back to its foundation and this is what the foundation actually supports, will rarely satisfy someone who has never done the same exercise themselves. Expect this friction. It is not a sign you are wrong. It is often a sign that you have found a real edge that analogy-based thinking simply cannot see. Hold on to that skill, because it sets up the next model perfectly. A tool that lets you solve problems not by moving forward from what is true, but by working backward from what would guarantee failure. Chapter 2. Inversion. Solving problems backward. There is a story about a legendary investor, one of the most successful in history, who was once asked the secret to his extraordinary track record. His answer surprised almost everyone in the room. He said that instead of asking how to become successful, he spent an enormous amount of his mental energy asking a very different question. Where will I die so that I never go there? Instead of chasing success directly, he spent his time meticulously identifying every possible way a venture, a decision, or a strategy could fail. And then he simply avoided those paths with total discipline. Over decades, this backward approach to thinking compounded into one of the greatest investment records ever recorded. That is the power of inversion. And once you understand it, you will start seeing it everywhere, hidden inside almost every genuinely great decision-maker in history. Most people approach problems only in one direction, forward. They ask, how do I achieve this goal? And then they try to construct a path toward it. This is intuitive, but it has a serious weakness. The forward direction is usually crowded with obvious, well-trodden ideas because everyone else is asking the exact same forward-facing question. Inversion flips the entire process around. Instead of asking how to succeed, you ask how you could guarantee failure. And then you spend your energy avoiding every single item on that list. This works because it is often far easier to identify stupidity than it is to identify genius. There are 1,000 ways to fail, and usually only a handful of ways to succeed, which means the failure list is longer, clearer, and much easier to build than the success list. Here is how to put this to work immediately. Take whatever goal or problem is currently sitting in front of you. A business decision, a relationship issue, a health goal, anything. Instead of starting with, how do I achieve this? Start with a different sentence entirely. If I wanted this to fail completely, catastrophically, embarrassingly, what would I do? Write down every single answer. Without censoring yourself. Would you ignore feedback? Would you refuse to adapt when circumstances changed? Would you spread your energy across too many things at once? Would you avoid difficult conversations? Would you let short-term comfort override long-term thinking? Once that list exists in front of you, in plain, uncomfortable language, your job becomes remarkably simple. You do not need a brilliant plan for success. You simply need the discipline to avoid every item on your failure list, one at a time, with total consistency. This model also works beautifully at a smaller scale, inside individual decisions, not just big life goals. Before sending an important email, ask, how could this message be completely misread or cause unnecessary offense, and then rewrite it to avoid that outcome? Before a difficult conversation, ask, what would make this conversation go as badly as possible? And then deliberately steer away from those triggers. Before starting a new habit, ask, What is the single most likely reason I will abandon this within 2 weeks? And then design your environment specifically to remove that reason before it ever becomes a problem. There is a deeper reason inversion works so well, beyond simple practicality. Human beings are naturally more sensitive to loss than to gain. The pain of losing something tends to feel far more intense than the pleasure of gaining something of equal size. Inversion works with this wiring instead of against it. Instead of fighting your brain's natural aversion to loss, you channel that aversion directly into your planning process, using your fear of failure as fuel for foresight, rather than allowing it to sit in the back of your mind as quiet, unaddressed anxiety. The result is a kind of built-in early warning system, one that catches your worst mistakes before you ever make them, rather than after. Inversion also has a quieter secondary use, one that most people never discover because they only apply the model once at the very beginning of a project and then abandon it. The truth is that inversion works just as powerfully in the middle of a struggling effort as it does at the start of a fresh one. If a business, a relationship, or a personal goal has been stalling for months and nothing seems to be working, most people respond by asking, what else can I add? What new tactic? What new effort? What new resource? Inversion suggests a different, often far more revealing question. What am I currently doing that is quietly guaranteeing this outcome will fail? And would I be willing to stop doing it today? Very often, the answer is not that something is missing. The answer is that something actively destructive has been present the entire time, hidden in plain sight, and no one has been willing to name it directly because doing so requires admitting a mistake rather than simply adding another attempted fix. There is also a subtler danger to be aware of once you start using this model, and it is worth naming clearly. Inversion is a tool for avoiding catastrophic mistakes, not a complete substitute for ambition. A person who only ever thinks about what to avoid without ever asking what bold, positive action might be worth pursuing tends to drift into a kind of defensive, overly cautious posture that avoids failure but also avoids meaningful progress. The most effective thinkers use inversion as a filter, not as their entire strategy. They still dream forward, they still ask what they want to build and achieve, but they run every forward-looking plan through the backward-looking filter of inversion before committing real time and resources to it. Use it that way, as a safety check layered on top of ambition, not as a replacement for ambition itself. Once you master thinking backward from failure, a natural next question emerges. Once you have removed the obvious ways to fail, how do you choose between the remaining, more complicated options in front of you? That is where our next model becomes essential. A tool that has been quietly guiding some of history's greatest scientific and strategic breakthroughs for centuries. Chapter 3. Occam's Razor. The Power of the Simplest Explanation. A physician sits across from a patient, describing a strange combination of symptoms: fatigue, occasional dizziness, a mild headache that comes and goes. A junior doctor, still early in training, might immediately start considering rare, exotic diagnoses, because rare conditions are memorable and dramatic, and they stick vividly in the mind from years of textbook study. But experienced physicians are trained, almost instinctively, to reach first for the simplest, most statistically common explanation that fits the available evidence: dehydration, poor sleep, stress. Not because rare conditions never happen, but because in the overwhelming majority of cases, the boring, ordinary explanation turns out to be the correct one. This principle, choosing the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions, is called Occam's razor, and it has quietly shaped scientific thinking for hundreds of years. Here is the core idea, stripped down to its essence. When you are faced with multiple possible explanations for the same set of facts, the explanation that requires the fewest additional assumptions is usually the correct one, or at the very least, it is the one you should test and rule out first. This does not mean the simplest answer is always right. Reality is sometimes genuinely complicated, and occasionally the strange, unlikely explanation does turn out to be true. But most of the time, when people arrive at wildly complicated explanations for ordinary events, it is not because reality is actually that complicated. It is because their own minds are adding unnecessary layers of assumption, suspicion, or story on top of a much simpler underlying truth. Think about how often this shows up in ordinary life, far outside of medicine or science. A friend does not reply to your message for a full day, and your mind starts constructing an elaborate theory. They are upset with you. They are pulling away from the relationship. You must have said something wrong in your last conversation. The simplest explanation, that they are simply busy, distracted, or their phone died, rarely gets considered first, because busy and distracted are boring, and boring explanations do not feel satisfying to a mind that is anxious and searching for meaning. Occam's razor asks you to notice this pattern and deliberately correct for it. Before reaching for the complicated, dramatic explanation, force yourself to seriously consider the boring one first, and only abandon it if the evidence genuinely does not fit. Here is how to apply this practically the next time you are confused, suspicious, or trying to solve a puzzling problem. Step 1. List out every explanation you can think of for the situation in front of you, from the most mundane to the most dramatic. Step 2. For each explanation, count how many additional assumptions it requires you to believe are also true. A dramatic explanation usually requires several other unproven assumptions to also be correct, while a simple explanation usually stands on its own with very little additional support required. Step 3. Start your investigation with the explanation that requires the fewest additional assumptions, and only move toward the more complicated explanations if the evidence actively contradicts the simple one. This model is not about assuming everything is always simple. It is about resisting the very human temptation to overcomplicate reality, especially when emotions like anxiety, suspicion, or wounded pride are involved, because those emotions have a powerful tendency to manufacture complicated narratives out of ordinary, boring facts. The sharpest thinkers in history were not the ones who could construct the most intricate theory. They were the ones disciplined enough to reach for the simplest one first, and rigorous enough to only add complexity when the evidence genuinely demanded it. There is an important nuance here that separates people who use this model well from people who misuse it entirely. Occam's razor does not say the simplest explanation is always correct, no matter what. It says the simplest explanation should be tested first and abandoned the moment it genuinely fails to account for the evidence in front of you. Plenty of important truths in history were, in fact, complicated, surprising, and far from simple. The danger is not that simple explanations are always right. It is that complicated explanations feel more satisfying to a certain kind of mind, the kind of mind that enjoys the drama of a complex narrative more than the flatness of an ordinary one. And that emotional preference has nothing to do with which explanation is actually true. You can see this pattern clearly in how people interpret their own setbacks and failures. When a plan does not work out, a project falls apart, or a goal is not reached, it is tempting to build an elaborate story involving bad luck, hidden sabotage, or forces working against you from every direction. Sometimes those forces are real, but far more often, when you strip the story down and apply the razor honestly, the explanation is something far more mundane: insufficient preparation, an unrealistic timeline, or simply not enough repetitions of the right actions. That explanation is less flattering and less dramatic than a story involving conspiracy or misfortune, which is exactly why so many people avoid it, even though it is usually the explanation most likely to actually help them improve. But simplicity in the moment is not the whole picture. A decision can be simple and still be wrong if you only look at its immediate first layer of consequences. Which brings us to a model that separates truly strategic thinkers from everyone else: the ability to see not just what happens next, but what happens after that. Chapter 4. Second-order thinking. Seeing past the first answer. During a period of severe drought, a certain government introduced a policy that seemed, on the surface, to be an obvious and elegant solution. Facing a dangerous overpopulation of a particular species that was destroying crops and spreading disease, officials offered a cash bounty for every dead specimen turned in. On its face, this was simple, common-sense economics. Reward the elimination of the pest, and the pest population should fall. This is first-order thinking. The very first, most obvious consequence of an action. And it is where most people's analysis stops entirely. But something unexpected happened. Enterprising citizens realized that instead of hunting the animals in the wild, which was slow and difficult, it was far more profitable to simply breed them in captivity and turn in the bodies for a steady stream of bounty payments. When the government eventually discovered this and cancelled the program, the breeders, now holding populations of animals that were suddenly worthless, released them into the wild. The result was a population of the very pest the policy was designed to eliminate that ended up larger than before the program ever began. The first-order effect looked like a solution. The second-order effect was a disaster. This is the danger of stopping your thinking too early, and it is exactly what second-order thinking is designed to prevent. Second-order thinking simply means asking, "And then what?" at least 2 or 3 times past your first, most obvious answer. Most people evaluate decisions only by their immediate first-order consequences, because those are the easiest to see and the fastest to reason through. But nearly every consequential decision in life, business, relationships, health, finance, sets off a chain reaction of further consequences, and those downstream effects often matter far more than the first, obvious one. The people who consistently make excellent long-term decisions are not smarter in some abstract sense. They have simply trained themselves to keep asking. And then what happens? Long after everyone else in the room has already stopped thinking and moved on, Here is exactly how to apply this the next time you are facing a significant decision. Write your initial choice or action at the top of a page. Underneath it, write the first-order consequence, the most immediate, obvious result of that action. Then, underneath that, ask, and then, what happens because of that consequence? And write down the second-order effect. Push yourself to go at least one layer further, asking, and then what happens because of that, to reach a third-order effect. By the time you have mapped out 3 layers of consequences, you will often notice something remarkable. The decision that looked obviously correct at the first layer sometimes looks questionable or even actively harmful. By the third layer, once the full chain of incentives and reactions has played out. This model is especially powerful in situations involving other people's incentives, because human beings are extraordinarily creative at finding the path of least resistance toward whatever they are being rewarded for, exactly like the citizens who started breeding the very pest they were being paid to eliminate. Before implementing any rule, policy, or incentive, whether in a business, a family, or your own personal habits, ask yourself, if someone wanted to exploit this rule while technically following it to the letter, how would they do it? That single question, asked honestly, will save you from an enormous number of well-intentioned decisions that quietly backfire. This same pattern shows up constantly in personal decisions that have nothing to do with formal policies or incentive programs. Consider someone who decides to reward themselves with an elaborate meal out every single time they complete a workout, as a way of reinforcing the new habit. The first-order effect looks completely positive. A built-in reward that should make the habit easier to sustain. But trace it one layer further. What happens to their overall health goals if that reward meal consistently outweighs the caloric benefit of the workout itself? What happens to their relationship with exercise if it becomes emotionally tangled up with a reward that quietly works against the very outcome the exercise was meant to produce? The second-order effect, in this case, can end up quietly undermining the first-order intention entirely, and the only way to catch that in advance is to deliberately trace the chain forward before committing to the plan. The same discipline applies beautifully to communication and leadership. A manager who publicly praises whichever employee closes the most sales in a given month believes, at the first-order level, that they are creating healthy competition and motivation. But pushed to a second and third order, this same policy can quietly teach employees to hoard leads, undercut teammates, or avoid collaborative deals that would help the company but split credit in a way that hurts their individual numbers. None of this is visible at the first-order level. It only becomes visible to someone willing to sit with the decision a little longer and ask, what happens next? And then, what happens after that? Second-order thinking teaches you to see the ripple effects of your choices. But there is a deeper trap waiting even beyond that. One that affects not just your decisions, but the very way you perceive reality itself. It is time to examine the models you use to understand the world, and the dangerous mistake of confusing those models for the world itself. Chapter 5. The map is not the territory. Imagine unfolding a paper map of a sprawling city before a long road trip. The map shows you roads, intersections, landmarks, a clean and orderly representation of the city laid out in neat lines and labeled streets. But no matter how detailed that map becomes, it will never be the actual city. It cannot show you the pothole that appeared last week, the construction crew blocking a side street this morning, the way sunlight glares directly into your eyes at a certain intersection during rush hour, or the thousand small, living details that exist only in the real, physical territory itself. The map is a useful simplification. It is not reality. And the moment you forget that distinction, the moment you start treating your map as though it were the territory itself, you become dangerously vulnerable to being wrong in ways you cannot even see. This idea extends far beyond literal maps, and it might be one of the most quietly important mental models on this entire list, because it applies to nearly every belief you hold. Your understanding of your industry is a map. Your understanding of another person's personality is a map. Your understanding of your own capabilities and limitations is a map. Every single one of these mental maps is a simplified, necessarily incomplete representation of a much more complex underlying reality. And every single one of them was built using limited information filtered through your own personal experiences, biases, and blind spots. Here is why this matters so much in practice. When you forget that your map is only a map, you stop updating it. You start treating your current understanding of a person, a market, a skill, or a situation as though it were the final, permanent truth, rather than a working draft that should be revised the moment new information arrives. This is exactly how brilliant people end up making outdated decisions. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they built an accurate map years ago, and then stopped checking it against the territory as the territory continued to change and evolve around them. Here is how you actively apply this model to avoid that exact trap. First, whenever you notice yourself holding a strong belief about a person, a market, or a situation, deliberately label it in your own mind as a map, not as reality itself. Silently say to yourself, "This is my current best model of the situation, not the situation itself." This small mental habit creates space for doubt, and doubt is precisely what keeps a map accurate over time. Second, actively and regularly seek out territory, meaning direct, first-hand, updated information, rather than relying purely on old assumptions or second-hand reports. If your map of a market was built 2 years ago, go get fresh data today. If your map of a relationship was built on how someone used to behave, pay close attention to how they are actually behaving right now, not how they behaved in the past. Third, treat any moment where reality contradicts your map not as a frustrating anomaly to be dismissed, but as extremely valuable information demanding an immediate update. The map is wrong, not the territory. And the map is the thing you have full authority to change. This model humbles even the most intelligent people, because it means every strong opinion you currently hold, no matter how confident you feel about it, is technically still just a simplified guess about a much more complicated underlying reality. But that humility is not a weakness. It is precisely what keeps a sharp thinker sharp over the course of an entire lifetime, rather than becoming a brilliant mind trapped inside an outdated map, still confidently navigating streets that no longer exist. Notice how often entire careers stall because of this exact failure. A person spends years building an accurate, sharp mental map of their industry, their skill set, and their market value. And that map genuinely serves them well for a long stretch of time. But industries shift, technology evolves, and the territory keeps moving even while the map stays frozen at the moment it was drawn. The person who once had a highly accurate picture of their field slowly becomes the person confidently giving directions to streets that have been demolished and rebuilt entirely. Not because they became less capable, but because they stopped treating their map as something requiring regular revision. The same trap appears in how people see each other. You form an impression of someone, a co-worker, a family member, a childhood friend, based on a limited window of interactions, often years in the past, and that impression hardens into a fixed label in your mind, difficult and slow to shake. Meanwhile, the actual person continues growing, changing, and becoming someone slightly different with every passing year, entirely unaware that you are still relating to them as though they were frozen at some earlier version of themselves. The healthiest relationships and the sharpest professional judgments both depend on the same underlying discipline, treating every impression as a map still open for revision rather than a verdict closed for good. There is one more layer to this model worth sitting with. The map is not only your understanding of external things like people and markets, it is also your understanding of yourself. The story you tell about your own strengths, your own limitations, your own identity is itself a map. Built years ago from a limited set of experiences, and it is just as prone to becoming outdated as any map of a city or an industry. Many people carry around a self-image formed in childhood or adolescence, painfully shy, not a numbers person, bad under pressure, and they never bother to check that old map against who they have actually become since then. Treat your own self-concept with the same discipline you would apply to any other map. Update it. Test it against current evidence. Do not let a description that was true a decade ago continue quietly steering decisions you make today. You now have 5 foundational tools. You can rebuild any problem from its basic truths instead of borrowed assumptions. You can work backward from failure to guarantee better outcomes. You can reach for the simplest explanation before chasing complicated stories. You can trace the ripple effects of your decisions several layers deep, and you can hold your own beliefs loosely enough to keep updating them as reality shifts beneath your feet. In the next section, we go further into the tools that help you know what you actually know, weigh risk and uncertainty like a professional, and see the hidden costs buried inside every single choice you make. Chapter 6. Circle of Competence, knowing the edges of what you actually know. One of the most successful investors of the 20th century built his entire fortune on a principle so simple that most people dismiss it as obvious wisdom, right before they go on to ignore it completely. He refused, decade after decade, to invest in businesses he did not genuinely understand, no matter how exciting, fashionable, or profitable those businesses appeared to be to everyone else around him. While other investors chased whatever technology or trend happened to be dominating headlines that year, he stayed inside a clearly defined boundary of industries he had spent years studying deeply. Consumer products, insurance, simple manufacturing, businesses whose mechanics he could explain in plain language without hesitation. This discipline cost him some short-term gains during certain booms. It also protected him from nearly every catastrophic bust that wiped out investors who confidently wandered into territory they did not actually understand. That discipline has a name. It is called the Circle of Competence. And learning to define your own is one of the quietest, most underrated superpowers a person can develop. Here is the core idea. Every person, no matter how intelligent or accomplished, has a limited zone of genuine expertise, an area where their knowledge is deep enough to make reliably good decisions. Outside that zone, even brilliant people become ordinary, prone to the exact same overconfident mistakes as complete amateurs, because intelligence in one domain does not automatically transfer to competence in another. The danger is not having a limited circle of competence. Everyone has one. The danger is failing to know exactly where the edges of that circle are and confidently making high-stakes decisions just past the boundary, mistaking general intelligence or past success in one area for genuine expertise in a completely different one. This trap catches smart, accomplished people constantly, and it catches them specifically because of their intelligence, not despite it. A brilliant surgeon assumes that because they are exceptionally skilled in medicine, their judgment about a friend's business plan must also be sharp, even though they have never run a business themselves. A successful entrepreneur assumes that because they built one thriving company, their instincts about an entirely unrelated industry must automatically transfer, even though the underlying dynamics of that new industry are completely different. This pattern is sometimes called the halo effect. The tendency to assume competence in one area implies competence everywhere else, and it is one of the most expensive mental habits a talented person can develop because it rarely gets punished immediately. It gets punished later, often at the worst possible moment, when the stakes are highest and the mistake is hardest to reverse. Here is how to define and respect your own circle of competence in practice. First, for any major decision, honestly ask yourself, have I spent enough real time and study in this exact area to actually understand its mechanics? Or am I simply borrowing confidence from success in a different area entirely? Be ruthless with this question, because your ego will instinctively want to answer yes, even when the honest answer is no. Second, distinguish clearly between familiarity and expertise. Reading a handful of articles about an industry or knowing someone who works in it creates familiarity, a comfortable feeling of understanding, but it does not create the deep, tested knowledge required for genuinely sound judgment. Familiarity is dangerous precisely because it feels like expertise from the inside, while looking nothing like expertise from the outside. Third, when a decision genuinely falls outside your circle, you have exactly two responsible options, not one. Either invest the real time required to expand your circle before deciding, studying deeply enough to actually understand the mechanics involved, or explicitly borrow the judgment of someone whose circle of competence genuinely covers that territory, and trust their expertise more than your own untrained instinct. There is a liberating side to this model that is easy to miss at first. Defining your circle of competence is not an admission of weakness. It is, paradoxically, one of the most confident things a person can do, because it means you no longer have to pretend to have an opinion about everything. You can say, with total ease, that is outside my area, and mean it as a statement of clarity rather than a confession of inadequacy. The people who seem to have the best judgment in the world are very often not the people who know the most about everything. They are the people who have the discipline to have strong opinions only inside their circle, and genuine humility everywhere else, which frees enormous mental energy for going deeper inside the areas that actually matter to them. There is also a practical exercise worth doing once, deliberately, rather than leaving your circle of competence as a vague, unexamined feeling. Sit down and actually draw 3 concentric circles on a page. In the innermost circle, write the specific areas where you have deep, tested, hard-won expertise, built through years of direct experience, not casual familiarity. In the middle circle, write the areas where you have meaningful but incomplete knowledge, enough to ask good questions and spot obvious mistakes, but not enough to make confident, high-stakes decisions alone. In the outer circle, write everything else, the vast majority of human knowledge, where your judgment should carry essentially no independent weight at all. Most people have never done this exercise, which means they are navigating every decision with an invisible, unexamined map of their own competence, and invisible maps are exactly the kind that lead people confidently into territory they have no business entering. There is a further wrinkle worth understanding, because the boundaries of your circle are not fixed for life. They are meant to move, deliberately and honestly, as you invest real effort into specific areas. The mistake is not having a limited circle today. The mistake is either refusing to expand it through genuine study and practice, staying comfortably small out of fear, or pretending it has already expanded simply because you want it to have, without doing the actual work required to earn that expansion. Treat your circle as something you can grow with intention, one carefully chosen area at a time, rather than either a fixed cage or a fantasy you can simply declare true. It is also worth noticing how your circle of competence should change your posture, not just your decisions. Inside your circle, speak with real confidence, because that confidence is earned, and it serves you and the people relying on your judgment. Just outside your circle, in that middle zone of partial understanding, adopt a posture of genuine curiosity, asking more questions than you answer, and treating every piece of new information as a chance to either expand your circle or confirm that this particular territory still belongs to someone else's expertise. Far outside your circle, adopt something closer to quiet respect, actively seeking out and deferring to people whose circle genuinely covers that ground, rather than quietly resenting the fact that your own opinion in that domain simply does not carry the weight you might wish it did. Knowing the edges of what you understand is powerful, but even inside your own circle of competence, certainty is rarely total. The next model teaches you how to make excellent decisions even when you cannot be completely sure of the outcome, which describes almost every meaningful decision you will ever face. Chapter 7. Probabilistic Thinking: Making Peace with Uncertainty. Most people think in binary terms without even realizing they are doing it. A decision is either right or wrong. A prediction is either true or false. A plan either works or it fails. This binary instinct feels natural, but it is a poor match for how reality actually operates, because almost nothing meaningful in life comes with absolute certainty attached to it. The sharpest thinkers in history, particularly those trained in science, medicine, and finance, learned to abandon this binary instinct entirely, replacing it with something far more accurate and far more useful, thinking in probabilities instead of certainties. Here is what this actually means in practice. Instead of asking, "Will this plan work?" a probabilistic thinker asks, "What is the realistic likelihood this plan works? And how does that likelihood compare to my other available options?" Instead of treating a single failed attempt as proof that an entire strategy is wrong, they recognize that even an excellent strategy, one with genuinely favorable odds, will still fail some percentage of the time, purely due to variance, the natural randomness present in almost every complex system. A poker player who makes a mathematically sound decision and still loses that particular hand did not make a bad decision. They made a good decision that happened to land on the losing side of the odds, and a skilled player understands the difference between those two things with total clarity, even when a losing streak makes that distinction emotionally difficult to hold on to. This distinction matters enormously in real life, far beyond card games. Consider someone who starts a new business using a genuinely well-researched, statistically sound approach, and the business still fails within its first year. A binary thinker concludes that the entire approach was flawed and abandons the underlying strategy entirely, sometimes concluding they simply are not cut out for entrepreneurship at all. A probabilistic thinker asks a more precise question. Given everything I knew at the time, was this genuinely the highest probability path available to me, or did I simply get unlucky within a fundamentally sound strategy? If the strategy was sound, the correct response to failure is not abandonment. It is another attempt, because a person who makes consistently good probabilistic decisions will still experience losses along the way, and judging a strategy purely by its most recent single outcome is one of the most common and costly errors in decision-making. There is a closely related skill worth learning alongside probabilistic thinking, called updating your beliefs as new evidence arrives, sometimes referred to by its more formal name, Bayesian updating. The core idea is straightforward. You should never hold a belief with either total, unshakable certainty or complete, dismissive doubt. Instead, hold every belief as a percentage, a rough confidence level, and adjust that percentage up or down as new, credible evidence arrives, rather than either ignoring new evidence entirely or completely discarding your previous understanding at the first sign of a contradiction. If you believed a coworker was reliable based on years of consistent behavior and they let you down once, the mathematically sound response is not to conclude they are now completely unreliable, nor to pretend the incident never happened. It is to adjust your confidence downward by a reasonable amount while still weighing the substantial prior evidence of their reliability, and then continuing to update as further evidence arrives. Here is how to apply both of these ideas together. Starting today, whenever you are making an important decision, resist the urge to think in absolute terms. Instead, force yourself to assign a rough percentage to your confidence level, even if that percentage is just an educated estimate. Something like, I am roughly 70% confident this approach will work, is a far more useful and honest starting point than a false, binary certainty in either direction. Then, whenever new information arrives that is relevant to that decision, deliberately revisit and adjust that percentage rather than letting your original confidence level sit frozen and unquestioned. This single habit, treating your beliefs as adjustable probabilities rather than fixed certainties, is one of the clearest markers separating excellent long-term decision-makers from people who repeatedly overreact to short-term noise. Probabilistic thinking also changes how you should feel about your own past decisions. And this shift in perspective can be enormously freeing for anyone who tends toward harsh self-judgment. Most people evaluate their own past choices purely by outcome. If it worked out, it was a good decision. If it did not, it was a bad decision. This is called outcome bias, and it is a deeply flawed way to learn from experience, because it completely ignores the information that was actually available at the time the decision was made. A probabilistic thinker separates the quality of a decision from the quality of its outcome. It is entirely possible to make a genuinely excellent decision, using all the best available information and sound reasoning, and still experience a poor outcome purely due to factors outside your control. It is equally possible to make a genuinely reckless, poorly reasoned decision and still get lucky with a good outcome. Judging yourself by outcomes alone will teach you exactly the wrong lessons over time, reinforcing lucky recklessness and punishing sound reasoning that simply landed on the wrong side of the odds. The correct question to ask after any decision is never simply, "Did it work out?" It is, "Given what I knew at the time, was this genuinely the highest probability choice available to me? And what, if anything, would I actually do differently with that same information in front of me again?" This distinction becomes especially important during a stretch of consecutive setbacks, because a string of bad outcomes can feel, emotionally, like undeniable proof that your entire approach is fundamentally broken, even when the underlying strategy remains statistically sound. A probabilistic thinker learns to distinguish between two very different situations that feel almost identical from the inside. The first is a flawed strategy producing predictably poor results, which genuinely does call for a change in approach. The second is a sound strategy experiencing an unlucky streak of variance, which calls for patience and continued execution, not abandonment. Confusing these two situations, treating ordinary variance as though it were proof of a flawed strategy, is one of the most common reasons people quit excellent, long-term approaches right before the odds were about to turn back in their favor. Thinking in probabilities helps you navigate uncertainty with far more precision and far less emotional whiplash. But there is another dimension to every decision that most people overlook entirely. Not the odds of success, but the invisible cost of what you give up the moment you choose one path over all the others available to you. Chapter 8. Opportunity Cost. The hidden price of every choice. Every single choice you make, no matter how small it seems in the moment, carries a hidden price tag that never appears on any receipt. Economists call this opportunity cost, the value of the next best alternative you gave up the moment you chose a particular path. Most people evaluate decisions by asking a single, incomplete question: is this a good choice? But a genuinely sound decision requires a second, far less comfortable question layered directly on top of the first one. Compared to what? Because a choice that looks perfectly reasonable in isolation can quietly become a poor decision the moment you compare it honestly against the best alternative you passed over to make it. This concept becomes clearest through money, because money makes the trade-off visible in a way that is hard to ignore. If you spend a significant sum on one particular purchase, that same sum of money is now permanently unavailable for every other purchase, investment, or opportunity that existed in that exact moment. The true cost of that purchase was never just the number printed on the price tag. The true cost was the price tag plus the value of the best alternative use of that same money, an alternative that now no longer exists for you, precisely because you chose something else instead. Most people never calculate this second number. They simply ask whether they can afford something, rather than asking whether it is genuinely the best possible use of that particular resource. compared to every realistic alternative available to them at that exact moment. But opportunity cost extends far beyond money, into the far more valuable and far more limited resource of time. Every single hour you spend on one activity is an hour permanently unavailable for every other activity that existed during that same window. And, unlike money, time cannot be earned back, saved for later, or borrowed against future income. This makes opportunity cost, when applied to time, arguably the single most important application of this entire model. Spending an evening scrolling through entertainment is not simply a neutral, harmless choice sitting in isolation. Its true cost includes the book that could have been read, the skill that could have been practiced, the relationship that could have been nurtured, or the rest that could have been genuinely restorative. All of the realistic alternatives that existed in that exact same window of time and were quietly given up the moment the other choice was made. Here is how to put this model to work without becoming paralyzed by it. Because taken to an extreme, obsessively calculating opportunity cost on every tiny decision would leave you unable to function at all. Reserve this deeper level of analysis specifically for your significant, recurring decisions and commitments, not your minor daily choices. Before committing real time, money, or energy to something substantial, explicitly ask yourself, what is the single best alternative use of this same resource that I am giving up by choosing this instead? Write both options down side by side if the decision genuinely matters, your current choice and its strongest realistic alternative, and compare them honestly rather than evaluating your current choice entirely on its own, disconnected from what else was actually available to you. This model also becomes extraordinarily useful when evaluating commitments you already made in the past, ones that quietly continue consuming your time or resources purely out of habit or inertia, long after their original justification has faded. A recurring weekly commitment, a long-running project that has stopped producing meaningful results, or a relationship that consistently drains far more than it gives, all deserve to be evaluated using the exact same opportunity cost lens you would apply to a brand new decision. Ask honestly, if I were not already doing this, would I choose to start it today, given everything else I could be doing with this same time and energy instead? If the honest answer is no, the discomfort of walking away is usually far smaller than the ongoing invisible cost of continuing to pay for an option you would never willingly choose again from scratch. There is also a specific psychological trap that makes people terrible at recognizing this kind of ongoing opportunity cost, and it is worth naming directly. Once time, money, or effort has already been invested in something, people feel a powerful pull to continue, purely to justify the resources already spent, even when continuing clearly costs more than it returns going forward. This is sometimes called the sunk cost fallacy, and it works directly against clear opportunity cost thinking, because it anchors your decision to the past instead of to the future. The past investment is already gone regardless of what you decide next. It cannot be recovered by continuing, and it should carry zero weight in your decision about what to do from this point forward. The only question that should matter is, given where things stand right now, is this still the best use of my future time and resources compared to the realistic alternatives available to me? Everything already spent is irrelevant to that forward-looking question, no matter how uncomfortable it feels to let go of something you have already poured yourself into. This same lens applies powerfully to career decisions that many people avoid examining honestly for years at a time. Someone who spent years training for a particular profession may continue in that profession long after it stopped being fulfilling or well-suited to their evolving strengths, purely because walking away would feel like wasting the years already invested. But those years are already spent regardless of what happens next. And the real question, the one opportunity cost, forces you to confront directly is whether continuing down that same path remains the best use of the years still ahead of you, compared honestly to the realistic alternatives you have available today. Asked that way, many decisions that felt impossibly difficult because of an emotional attachment to the past suddenly become much clearer when evaluated purely against the future. It is worth pointing out one more layer to this model. Because opportunity cost is not only about what you give up by choosing one option over another. It is also about what you give up by refusing to choose at all. Indecision itself carries a real, ongoing opportunity cost, one that is easy to overlook precisely because it feels safe and neutral in the moment. Every week spent deliberating over a decision without acting is a week in which the best available alternative was also not pursued. Meaning the cost of hesitation is not zero, it is simply hidden behind the comfortable illusion that delaying a choice is the same thing as avoiding a cost. It rarely is. In most meaningful decisions, the period of prolonged uncertainty itself becomes the most expensive option on the table, more costly than either of the choices you were actually deliberating between, precisely because it forecloses the compounding benefits that an earlier, decisive choice in either direction would have already started generating. Seeing the hidden cost behind every choice sharpens your judgment considerably. But there is one more crucial adjustment worth making. One specifically related to how you interpret other people's behavior, especially when that behavior frustrates, disappoints, or confuses you. Chapter 9. Hanlon's Razor. Choosing understanding over suspicion. There is a simple, deceptively powerful principle that has quietly saved countless relationships, business partnerships, and reputations from unnecessary destruction. It states, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by incompetence, carelessness, ignorance, or simple human error. In other words, before assuming someone deliberately meant to hurt, insult, or sabotage you, seriously consider the much more common, much less dramatic possibility that they simply made a mistake, misunderstood something, or were dealing with pressures and limitations you cannot see from the outside. This model matters because human beings have a powerful, almost automatic tendency to interpret negative outcomes as intentional, especially when those outcomes affect us personally. A colleague forgets to include you on an important email, and the mind immediately reaches for a story involving deliberate exclusion rather than the far more mundane and statistically likely explanation of a simple oversight during a busy, distracted moment. A friend cancels plans at the last minute, and instead of considering that they might genuinely be overwhelmed, exhausted, or dealing with something private, the mind jumps directly to a narrative about the friendship no longer being valued. This tendency to assume intentional harm behind ordinary human error is called the fundamental attribution error by psychologists, and it quietly poisons an enormous number of relationships that could have remained perfectly healthy if the more generous, more statistically likely explanation had simply been considered first. Here is why this bias runs so deep and feels so automatic. Assuming malice actually serves a strange, protective emotional function. If someone deliberately hurt you, it means the world is at least predictable and comprehensible, even if that predictability is unpleasant. Assuming incompetence or simple human limitation, on the other hand, requires you to accept a messier, less satisfying truth that people are flawed, distracted, overwhelmed, and imperfect, without any of it necessarily being directed at you personally. That messier truth is actually far more accurate most of the time, but it is less emotionally tidy than a clean story involving intentional harm, which is exactly why so many people default to the less accurate, but more emotionally satisfying explanation, without ever examining it critically. Here is how to apply this model the next time someone disappoints, frustrates, or seemingly slights you. Before reacting, pause and deliberately ask yourself a specific question. Is there a realistic, non-malicious explanation for this behavior? One involving stress, distraction, poor communication, competing priorities, or simple human limitation rather than deliberate intent to harm me? In the overwhelming majority of cases, once you genuinely search for that explanation, instead of reaching immediately for the darker one, you will find it sitting right there, plausible and often even likely, waiting to replace the more dramatic story your mind initially constructed. It is important to be precise about what this model does not say, because taken too far, it can become naive rather than wise. Hanlon's razor does not mean you should ignore genuine, repeated patterns of malicious or harmful behavior once they become clear through consistent evidence. It is not a call to remain endlessly forgiving of someone who has demonstrated, again and again, that their harmful actions are deliberate rather than accidental. It is specifically a call to resist the instinctive leap to malice on a single incident or ambiguous piece of evidence, giving the more likely, more human explanation a genuine chance to be considered first, while still remaining alert enough to recognize an actual pattern of intentional harm if one does eventually emerge through repeated, consistent behavior over time. Applied correctly, this single mental adjustment removes an enormous amount of unnecessary conflict, resentment, and wasted emotional energy from everyday life, while still leaving you fully capable of recognizing genuine bad faith when the evidence honestly supports it. There is also a version of this model worth applying to yourself, not just to other people. And this direction is often even more transformative than the outward-facing version. Many people, after making a mistake, immediately interpret their own error through the harshest possible lens, assuming it reveals some deep character flaw, laziness, stupidity, or a fundamental lack of discipline, rather than considering the more accurate, more generous explanation that they are a normally capable person who made an ordinary human error under ordinary human conditions like fatigue, distraction, or simply insufficient information at the time. Applying Hanlon's razor internally means extending yourself the same reasonable benefit of the doubt you are learning to extend to others, treating your own mistakes as data to learn from rather than evidence to be used against yourself in some ongoing internal trial. This does not mean avoiding accountability. It means separating accountability from cruelty, which are two very different things that are easy to confuse when you are being hard on yourself. It also helps to notice how often this model quietly improves communication before conflict even has a chance to form. When you approach a disagreement already, assuming the other person probably has a reasonable, non-malicious explanation for their behavior, your tone, your word choice, and your body language all shift accordingly, usually without any conscious effort on your part. You ask questions instead of making accusations. You say, "Help me understand what happened here," instead of, "Why would you do that to me?" That single shift in framing, built entirely on the assumption of good faith rather than malice, diffuses an enormous number of conflicts before they ever have the chance to escalate into something far more damaging than the original misunderstanding ever needed to become. Choosing understanding over suspicion protects your relationships and your peace of mind. But there is one more model in this section, a diagnostic lens that helps you see with unusual clarity exactly where your limited time and energy are actually creating results and where they are quietly being wasted. Chapter 10. The Pareto Principle as a Diagnostic Tool, Finding Your Hidden Leverage Points. A now famous observation, first made by an economist studying land ownership patterns, noticed something curious. A small percentage of the population owned a disproportionately large share of the land, roughly 20% of people controlling roughly 80% of the property. What started as a narrow economic observation turned out to describe a pattern that appears again and again across an astonishing range of unrelated systems, a small portion of inputs consistently producing a disproportionately large share of outputs. This pattern, now widely known as the Pareto Principle or the 80-20 rule, has become one of the most widely applied mental models in business and personal productivity, but most people only ever use it in its most basic, surface-level form, identifying which 20% of tasks produce 80% of results. There is a deeper, more diagnostic way to use this same principle, and that deeper application is what actually separates people who casually know about the 80-20 rule from people who use it to meaningfully transform how they operate. Here is the diagnostic version of this model. Instead of simply asking which actions produce the most results, ask a sharper, more specific question. Within the small set of actions that are already producing most of my results, is there an even smaller subset producing the majority of that value? This is sometimes called applying the principle recursively, running the same 80-20 filter again inside the group you already identified as your highest value activities. Very often, you will discover that even within your top 20% of activities, a further 80-20 split exists, meaning a remarkably small handful of specific actions are quietly responsible for the overwhelming majority of everything meaningful you produce, while the rest of your supposedly high-value activity is really just comfortable, familiar busy work wearing the disguise of importance. This diagnostic use becomes especially powerful when applied to relationships and sources of stress, rather than only to productivity and output. Consider the sources of stress or friction in your current life, and instead of asking generally what is causing you stress, ask specifically which small handful of recurring situations, people, or obligations account for the overwhelming majority of my day-to-day frustration. Very often, once you actually sit down and honestly map this out, you discover that a shockingly small number of specific triggers, perhaps a single difficult relationship, one recurring type of conflict, or one poorly structured part of your daily routine, are responsible for a wildly disproportionate share of your total stress, while dozens of smaller, more visible annoyances that feel significant in the moment are actually contributing almost nothing to your overall well-being by comparison. Here is how to run this diagnostic properly. Take any area of your life you want to improve: your income, your health, your relationships, your creative output, and make an honest, complete list of every activity or factor currently involved in that area. Then rank that list by actual impact, not by how much time or attention each item currently receives, because those two things are very often mismatched in ways that are uncomfortable to admit. Identify the smallest possible cluster of items responsible for the largest share of your results or your problems. Then ask the recursive question one more time. Within that smaller cluster, is there an even smaller subset doing even more of the heavy lifting? Keep asking that question until you reach a point so specific and so concentrated that it feels almost too simple to be true, because that uncomfortable simplicity is usually the exact sign that you have found genuine leverage rather than another comfortable distraction. Once you find that concentrated point of leverage, the final step is the one most people skip entirely, even after doing the analysis correctly. You must be willing to aggressively protect and expand that small, high-leverage cluster, while deliberately reducing your investment in the much larger portion of activity that is producing comparatively little. This often means having uncomfortable conversations, ending commitments that feel productive but are not, and redirecting energy away from things that look impressive on the surface but are quietly contributing very little beneath it. The 80-20 rule is not just an interesting observation about how the world tends to be structured. Used diagnostically and repeatedly, it becomes a precise instrument for locating exactly where your limited time and energy will produce the greatest possible return, cutting straight through the noise of everything that merely looks important. There is a subtle reason this recursive application works so consistently across so many different areas of life. And understanding it helps you trust the process even when the results feel uncomfortably narrow at first. Concentrated effort compounds, a skill practiced with real focus for a small number of high-quality hours, tends to produce far more genuine improvement than the same total number of hours spread thin across scattered low-intensity practice. A handful of deep, well-maintained relationships tend to provide far more genuine support and connection than a much larger number of shallow, surface-level ones. This is not simply a coincidence of how the world happens to be organized. It is because depth itself generates returns that breadth cannot, and the 80-20 pattern is really just a visible symptom of that deeper underlying truth about how concentrated attention compounds over time in a way that scattered attention never can. It is worth adding one final caution about this model, because it is easy to misuse in a way that quietly damages the exact system you are trying to optimize. Not every low-output activity is genuinely wasteful and safe to eliminate. Some activities that appear low value in a narrow, short-term analysis actually serve a supporting or stabilizing function that only becomes visible over a longer time horizon. Maintenance tasks, foundational relationships, or quiet recovery time that does not look productive on paper but keeps the entire system functioning well enough to sustain the high-leverage activities in the first place. Before cutting anything identified as low value, ask one additional question. Does this activity, even though it is not directly producing results, quietly support the conditions that allow my high-leverage activities to keep working? If the honest answer is yes, it is not actually part of the wasteful 80% at all. It is invisible infrastructure, and cutting it will eventually undermine the very leverage points you worked so hard to identify and protect. One more distinction is worth making before moving forward. because people frequently apply this model only once and then stop, treating the result as a permanent, fixed conclusion rather than a living diagnosis that needs to be revisited. The specific 20% that drives your results today is not guaranteed to remain the same 20% 6 months or a year from now. Circumstances shift, markets change, relationships evolve, and your own skills grow, all of which can quietly move the location of your highest leverage activities without you noticing, especially if you simply keep operating on the conclusions of an analysis you ran a long time ago and never repeated. Treat this diagnostic the same way you would treat updating a map against a changing territory, revisiting it periodically rather than assuming the leverage points you identified once will remain fixed forever. You now have 10 tools in your collection. You know the edges of your own competence and how to act responsibly at those edges rather than confidently past them. You know how to hold your beliefs as probabilities rather than false certainties, updating them as new evidence arrives. You know how to see the hidden cost behind every choice, not just the visible price tag. You know how to extend understanding before suspicion when other people's behavior frustrates you. And you know how to diagnostically locate the small, concentrated points of leverage hiding inside a much larger, noisier picture. In the final section, we bring everything together with the models that shape how the sharpest strategists in history have handled risk, regret, and the art of turning every single one of these tools into a single, unified way of thinking. Chapter 11. The Regret Minimization Framework. Making decisions from the end of your life. Before leaving a stable, well-paying career to start an uncertain new venture selling books over the internet, a young executive used a simple but remarkably powerful thought experiment to make what felt, at the time, like an almost irrational decision. He imagined himself at 80 years old, looking back over the entire arc of his life, and asked a single question: which choice, staying in the safe and comfortable job or taking the leap into the unknown, would he regret more when there was no longer any time left to change course? The answer arrived almost instantly, and with total clarity. He knew that failing at the new venture would sting for a while, but it would fade. What would never fade, what would sit with him permanently, was the quiet, corrosive regret of never having tried at all. That single mental exercise, projecting forward to the end of a life and reasoning backward from there, became one of the most consequential decisions in modern business history, and it has a name: the Regret Minimization Framework. Here is why this model works so powerfully, and why it cuts through confusion in a way that ordinary pro and con lists rarely manage to achieve. Most difficult decisions feel paralyzing because they are being evaluated entirely from inside the present moment, where fear, comfort, and short-term discomfort all carry an enormous, distorting weight. Fear of failure feels enormous right now. Fear of judgment from other people feels enormous right now. The comfort of staying exactly where you are feels enormous right now. But almost none of these present moment feelings hold anywhere near the same weight when viewed from decades in the future, looking backward at a life already lived. The Regret Minimization Framework works by deliberately shifting your vantage point away from the distorted present and toward the far clearer, far more honest perspective of your future self looking back. A self who no longer cares about looking foolish in front of people who will not remember the moment anyway, and who cares enormously about whether meaningful chances were taken or quietly avoided. Here is exactly how to use this model on a genuinely difficult decision. Close your eyes. or simply sit quietly and imagine yourself decades from now, near the end of a long, full life, reflecting honestly on the choice sitting in front of you today. Ask specifically, not which option feels safer right now, but which option, if I never attempted it, would leave the deeper, more permanent sense of regret when I am too old to do anything about it. Notice that this question is not simply asking which option might work out better. It is asking which option you could live with never having tried. And, for the overwhelming majority of genuinely meaningful, ambitious decisions, the honest answer becomes remarkably clear the moment you actually run this exercise seriously, rather than simply reading about it as an interesting idea. There is an important nuance to using this model correctly, one that prevents it from being misapplied as a justification for recklessness. Regret minimization is specifically designed for decisions involving meaningful values, aligned risk, situations where the primary danger is the quiet, permanent regret of inaction rather than genuine catastrophic, irreversible harm. It is not a framework for justifying decisions that could cause serious, irreversible damage to your health, your finances beyond recovery, or the well-being of people who depend on you, simply because avoiding those risks might feel emotionally unsatisfying in the moment. The framework is a tool for cutting through the fog of ordinary fear and social discomfort surrounding worthwhile, recoverable risks, not a license to ignore genuinely dangerous ones, applied to the right category of decision. However, few tools cut through decision paralysis as cleanly, because it replaces a confusing, present-moment tangle of competing anxieties with a single, remarkably clarifying question, asked from the calm, honest distance of an entire lifetime. It is also worth noticing which specific category of regret tends to dominate this exercise once people actually run it honestly. When people near the end of their lives reflect back on their choices, the deepest regrets are almost never about the risks they took that did not work out. Those regrets tend to fade, softened by time, and by the simple fact that an attempt was genuinely made. The deepest, most persistent regrets are almost always about the things never attempted at all, the conversation never had, the opportunity never pursued, the version of themselves they quietly suspected they could have become, but never gave a real chance to develop. This asymmetry is precisely why the regret minimization framework tends to push people toward action rather than caution, not because action is inherently superior to caution in every situation, but because the emotional weight of inaction, viewed honestly from a lifetime's distance, is consistently heavier than most people expect it to be while still standing inside the fear of the present moment. There is one more practical refinement worth adding to this model, a way of using it even when the decision in front of you does not feel dramatic or life-altering enough to warrant imagining yourself at 80 years old. Smaller, everyday decisions can be run through a compressed version of the same exercise. Imagining yourself not decades from now, but simply 1 year from now, looking back at this exact week. Ask, 1 year from today, will I be glad I had this difficult conversation, started this project, or set this boundary? Or will I still be carrying the quiet, low-grade regret of having avoided it? This shorter time horizon version of the framework will not carry quite the same clarifying power as the full lifetime version, but it remains remarkably effective at cutting through the kind of everyday avoidance left unaddressed, tends to compound silently into exactly the larger, more painful regrets the full framework is designed to prevent in the first place. This model gives you clarity about which risks are worth taking. But taking a worthwhile risk is only half the equation. The next model addresses something even more fundamental: how to structure your life and your decisions so that uncertainty and disorder actually make you stronger rather than simply something you learn to tolerate or survive. Chapter 12. Anti-fragility. Becoming stronger through disorder. There is a specific category of things in the world that break down under stress. And everyone understands this category intuitively. Glass shatters when dropped, and a poorly built structure collapses under sufficient pressure. This is called fragility. There is a second, more familiar category: things that resist stress and remain essentially unchanged. A steel beam bends under enormous pressure but returns to its original shape once the pressure is removed. This is called resilience or robustness. And most people, when they think about building a strong life, career, or mindset, are aiming for exactly this: robustness, the ability to withstand shocks without being permanently damaged by them. But there is a third category, one so counterintuitive that human language did not even have a word for it until relatively recently: a category of things that do not merely withstand stress and disorder, but actually become stronger, sharper, and more capable, specifically because of exposure to that same stress and disorder. This third category is called anti-fragility, and understanding it changes how you should think about risk, difficulty, and discomfort. At the deepest level, consider how human muscle tissue actually works. It does not grow stronger through comfort, rest, and the complete avoidance of physical stress. It grows stronger through the deliberate application of stress, specifically the microscopic damage caused by resistance training, followed by a period of recovery during which the tissue rebuilds itself slightly stronger than it was before the stress was applied. Remove the stress entirely, and the muscle does not remain strong. It atrophies and weakens. This is the essential signature of an anti-fragile system, one that requires a certain amount of disorder, difficulty, and stress, not merely to survive, but to actually develop and improve, and one that paradoxically becomes weaker, not stronger, when placed in an environment of total, prolonged comfort and predictability. This same pattern extends far beyond physical muscle, into skills, businesses, relationships, and entire ways of living. A person who has never faced meaningful adversity, difficulty, or failure often turns out to be strangely fragile when a genuine challenge finally arrives, precisely because their capacity to handle stress was never actually developed through exposure. It was simply untested. Meanwhile, a person who has weathered repeated setbacks, and specifically extracted real lessons from each one rather than simply enduring them passively, often develops a kind of durable, hard-won strength that cannot be replicated through comfortable theoretical study alone. This does not mean seeking out unnecessary suffering for its own sake. It means recognizing that a certain calibrated amount of difficulty, faced directly rather than avoided, is not merely tolerable, it is genuinely necessary for real growth, and systems, careers, and people that are shielded from all difficulty tend to become quietly brittle over time, even while appearing outwardly stable. Here is how to deliberately build more anti-fragility into your own life, rather than simply waiting passively for difficulty to arrive on its own schedule. First, identify areas of your life that have become overly protected from any form of stress or challenge. Comfortable routines, avoided conversations, skills you have not tested in years. These areas are quietly at risk of fragility, precisely because they have not been stress tested in a controlled, intentional way. Second, deliberately introduce small, manageable doses of difficulty into these areas, on your own terms, before life forces a much larger, unplanned dose of difficulty onto you without any warning. This might mean voluntarily taking on a challenging project before you feel fully ready, deliberately having a difficult conversation you have been avoiding, or exposing a business plan to harsh, honest scrutiny before committing significant resources to it. Third, after any setback, whether deliberately sought or unexpectedly encountered, resist the instinct to simply recover back to your previous baseline and move on. Instead, ask specifically what this particular difficulty revealed about a weakness in your current approach, and use that information to rebuild slightly stronger than you were before, the same way trained muscle tissue rebuilds itself after the specific stress of resistance training. There is one more critical element to anti-fragility that is easy to overlook, and it involves structuring your risk exposure asymmetrically. An anti-fragile approach to risk means deliberately limiting your exposure to any single catastrophic, unrecoverable loss, while remaining open to a large number of small, manageable, potentially informative setbacks along the way. This is why reckless, all-or-nothing risk-taking is not actually anti-fragile behavior at all, despite sometimes being mistaken for it. True anti-fragility looks like placing many small, carefully bounded bets, where the downside of any single failure is limited and recoverable, while the potential upside of any single success is disproportionately large and largely unbounded. Structured this way, disorder and uncertainty stop being purely threatening forces to be feared and minimized, and instead become a raw material, one that, applied correctly through many small, bounded exposures, can be converted directly into growth, capability, and long-term strength. This asymmetric structure is worth applying quite literally to how you design your week, your career, and even your relationships. Not just to formal financial decisions. Consider dedicating a small, clearly bounded portion of your time or resources specifically to experiments with limited downside and genuinely large potential upside. A new skill explored purely out of curiosity. A small side project with no guaranteed payoff. A new professional relationship pursued without a clear, immediate benefit in mind. Most of these small bets will produce nothing especially remarkable, and that is completely fine, because their cost was deliberately kept small and recoverable from the very beginning. But occasionally, one of these small, bounded experiments produces a genuinely outsized result. A new skill that becomes a career, a side project that becomes a primary source of income, a casual relationship that becomes a defining professional partnership. The overall system, viewed across many such small bets rather than any single one in isolation, becomes stronger and more capable over time, precisely because of this consistent exposure to bounded uncertainty, exactly the same mechanism by which trained muscle tissue grows stronger through repeated, bounded stress, rather than through either complete avoidance of stress or a single, unbounded, catastrophic overload. It is worth being honest about the emotional discomfort involved in deliberately seeking out this kind of manageable difficulty, because comfort and safety feel good in the short term in a way that makes them genuinely seductive, even when they are quietly producing long-term fragility. Building anti-fragility into your life requires a specific kind of discipline, the willingness to feel slightly uncomfortable on a regular, ongoing basis, in exchange for a form of strength and adaptability that pure comfort-seeking can never produce. This is not about suffering for its own sake, and it is not about ignoring genuine rest and recovery, which remain essential parts of any sustainable system. It is about recognizing that a life engineered for maximum comfort and minimum challenge is not actually the safest possible life. It is often the most quietly fragile one, brittle and unprepared for the disorder that eventually arrives for everyone, whether invited in deliberately and on manageable terms, or forced in unexpectedly and all at once. Becoming stronger through disorder requires a certain honesty about how you gather and interpret information in the first place, because it is entirely possible to face difficulty repeatedly and still learn nothing from it, if your mind is quietly filtering out the evidence that would actually teach you something. That filtering problem is exactly what the next model addresses directly. Chapter 13. Confirmation Bias. The discipline of seeking, disconfirming evidence. Here is one of the most quietly destructive patterns in human thinking, one that operates so smoothly and so invisibly that most people go their entire lives without ever noticing it happening inside their own mind. Once a person forms a belief, whether about a business strategy, a political opinion, another person's character, or their own abilities, their mind begins, almost automatically, to notice and remember information that confirms that existing belief, while simultaneously overlooking, dismissing, or quickly forgetting information that contradicts it. This is called confirmation bias. And it means that the more strongly you already believe something, the more evidence you will seem to accumulate supporting that belief, regardless of whether the belief is actually true, simply because your own mind has quietly become a filtering mechanism that lets in agreement and blocks out disagreement. This bias is dangerous precisely because it does not feel like bias from the inside. It feels like careful, rational observation. Because you genuinely are noticing real evidence, you are simply noticing it selectively, in a way that consistently points back toward what you already believed before you started looking. A person convinced that a particular business strategy will succeed will notice every small positive sign and interpret ambiguous signals generously, while barely registering warning signs that a more neutral observer would find obvious and concerning. A person convinced that a colleague dislikes them will interpret a neutral facial expression as evidence of hostility, while barely noticing the many ordinary, friendly interactions that would contradict that belief if given equal weight. In both cases, the person genuinely believes they are simply following the evidence, without realizing that the evidence itself was filtered by the belief long before it ever reached conscious awareness. Here is the specific discipline that counteracts this bias, and it requires deliberately doing something that feels unnatural and even uncomfortable at first, actively searching for the evidence that would prove you wrong, rather than simply waiting passively for it to appear on its own. Most people only ever look for evidence that would confirm what they already believe, and it is almost never enough to simply be open to disconfirming evidence if it happens to show up. You must actively hunt for it. on purpose, the same way a rigorous scientist actively designs experiments specifically intended to try to disprove their own hypothesis, rather than simply designing experiments intended to prove it correct. Here is how to build this discipline into your own decision-making process. Whenever you hold a strong belief about something important, deliberately ask yourself a specific, uncomfortable question. What is the strongest possible evidence that would prove this belief wrong? And have I actually gone looking for it? Or have I only been passively waiting to see if it happens to appear? Then go looking for it directly. If you believe a particular strategy is working, seek out the specific data points most likely to reveal that it is not, rather than simply reviewing the data points most likely to confirm your existing confidence. If you believe you understand another person's motivations, deliberately seek out an alternative explanation for their behavior and give it a genuinely fair hearing, rather than simply reviewing your first interpretation and looking for reasons to keep it. There is a second, closely related habit worth building alongside this one. Deliberately seeking out people who disagree with you, and specifically the smartest, most well-informed version of that disagreement you can find, rather than the weakest, easiest to dismiss version. It is remarkably easy to feel confident in a belief if you only ever expose yourself to the worst arguments against it, because dismantling a weak argument feels satisfying and reinforces your existing confidence without actually testing it. Seek out the strongest, most carefully reasoned disagreement available, from people who have genuinely thought deeply about the opposite position, and give that disagreement a fair, honest hearing before deciding whether your original belief actually survives the encounter. If it does survive contact with the strongest available counter-argument, your confidence in it becomes genuinely earned rather than simply comfortable. If it does not survive, you have just avoided a mistake that confirmation bias would have kept you walking directly toward indefinitely without ever noticing the danger. There is a particular version of this bias worth watching for closely, because it becomes considerably more dangerous the more successful and respected you become in a given area. Early success at anything tends to harden into a fixed narrative about why that success happened. And once that narrative forms, confirmation bias begins protecting it aggressively, filtering out any evidence suggesting the original explanation might be incomplete, outdated, or simply wrong. A person who succeeded early using one particular approach can become so attached to the story of why that approach worked that they stop noticing when changing circumstances have quietly made the same approach far less effective than it once was. Continuing to interpret ambiguous new evidence as further confirmation of an explanation that increasingly no longer fits. Success, paradoxically, often makes a person more vulnerable to this bias rather than less, precisely because the stakes of admitting the original story might be incomplete. Feel higher once real accomplishment has already been built on top of it. Building genuine resistance to this bias also requires a specific kind of emotional discipline, because discovering that you were wrong about something important rarely feels good in the moment, even though it is genuinely valuable information. Train yourself to notice the specific physical and emotional sensation of encountering evidence that contradicts something you believe. A small flash of defensiveness, a quick urge to dismiss the source, an impulse to change the subject. That sensation is not a signal to protect your existing belief more aggressively. It is a signal that you have just encountered exactly the kind of information most worth examining closely, precisely because your own mind's automatic defensiveness is a reliable marker that something important and uncomfortable might be true. Seeking out disconfirming evidence protects the accuracy of any single belief. But there is a broader lens still worth adding, one that shows you how individual pieces of evidence, individual decisions, and individual actions all connect together into larger, interconnected systems, where small changes in one place can produce large, sometimes unexpected effects somewhere else entirely. Chapter 14. Systems Thinking. Seeing the web instead of the parts. Most people, when trying to solve a persistent problem, instinctively look for a single cause and a single corresponding fix, the way you might replace a single broken part in a simple machine. This approach works reasonably well for genuinely simple, linear problems, but it fails badly when applied to complex, interconnected situations, which describes almost every meaningful, persistent problem in business, health, relationships, and personal development. These situations are not simple machines with one broken part waiting to be swapped out. They are systems, networks of interconnected elements that influence each other constantly, often in ways that are not obvious from looking at any single piece in isolation. Systems thinking is the discipline of stepping back far enough to see the entire interconnected web at once, rather than fixating on a single isolated piece of it. And it consistently reveals solutions that pure, linear, single-cause thinking simply cannot access. Here is a concept at the heart of systems thinking that changes how you diagnose persistent problems. The idea of a feedback loop. A feedback loop exists whenever the output of a system circles back around to influence its own future behavior, either amplifying the original effect, called a reinforcing loop, or dampening and correcting it, called a balancing loop. Consider a simple, common example. A person who feels increasingly anxious about their financial situation. That anxiety leads to avoidant behavior, ignoring bank statements, delaying important financial decisions, refusing to make a budget. That avoidance leads directly to a worsening financial situation. Precisely because problems left unaddressed tend to compound over time. The worsening situation then produces even more anxiety than before, which produces even more avoidance, which produces even further financial deterioration. This is a reinforcing feedback loop. And notice something crucial about it. The anxiety is not simply a symptom sitting passively outside the system, reacting to it. It is an active, causal part of the system itself, feeding directly back into the very problem that originally caused it. Systems thinking teaches you to look for exactly these kinds of loops before attempting any fix, because attempting to solve a system problem by addressing only one visible symptom, without accounting for the loop feeding into it, tends to produce solutions that fail quickly or even make the underlying problem worse. In the financial anxiety example, simply telling the anxious person to stop worrying without addressing the avoidant behavior driving the actual financial deterioration fails to interrupt the loop at all. Simply forcing them to look at their bank statements once without addressing the underlying anxiety that made avoidance feel necessary in the first place may also fail, because the anxiety itself will likely reassert control the moment the forced intervention ends. A systems-level fix requires interrupting the loop at multiple points simultaneously, addressing both the emotional driver and the practical behavior together, rather than treating either one as the single, isolated root cause. Here is how to apply systems thinking to a persistent problem in your own life. First, instead of asking, "What single thing is causing this problem?" ask a broader question. What are all the different elements involved in this situation, and how do they influence each other? Draw them out if it helps, connecting each element to the others it visibly affects. Second, specifically look for feedback loops, places where one element's effect eventually circles back around to influence its own original cause, whether reinforcing the problem further or naturally correcting it over time. Third, once you have identified a reinforcing loop that is actively making a problem worse, look for what is called a leverage point, a specific place within that loop where a relatively small, well-targeted intervention could interrupt the cycle entirely. Rather than attempting to fight the problem everywhere at once with equal, scattered effort. Leverage points are rarely the most visible or dramatic element of a system. They are often a quiet, structural piece, hiding in plain sight, easy to overlook precisely because it does not look, on the surface, like the obvious center of the problem. This model also carries an important, humbling lesson, one worth sitting with directly. Complex systems, almost by their very nature, resist simple, one-time fixes, and anyone promising a single, permanent solution to a genuinely complex, interconnected problem is very likely oversimplifying something that deserves more careful, ongoing attention. Systems thinking does not promise clean, final solutions. It promises a clearer view of how a persistent problem is actually structured, which allows you to intervene with far more precision and to expect, realistically, that meaningful change in a complex system usually requires sustained, thoughtful adjustment over time, rather than a single dramatic fix applied once and then forgotten. This lens becomes especially useful for understanding why certain personal patterns feel so difficult to change despite genuine, repeated effort. A person who has tried repeatedly to build a consistent exercise habit, for example, and failed each time despite real motivation, is very often fighting a reinforcing loop they have never actually mapped out clearly. Poor sleep leads to low energy. Low energy leads to skipped workouts. Skipped workouts lead to disrupted routine. Disrupted routine leads to poor sleep, and the entire loop quietly resets itself. Every time willpower alone is applied to just one visible piece of it, usually the workout itself, while the deeper structural loop remains completely untouched and ready to reassert control the moment motivation fades. Systems thinking reframes the entire problem, shifting the question from "why do I lack the discipline to exercise?" to "what is the actual structure of the loop keeping this pattern in place, and where within that loop does a small, well-placed change have the best chance of interrupting it?" It is also worth noticing how systems thinking changes your relationship with blame, both toward yourself and toward other people involved in a shared problem. Linear, single-cause thinking tends to produce a search for someone or something to blame, a single faulty part to point at and hold responsible. Systems thinking replaces that search with a more accurate and often more useful question. Not who or what caused this, but what structure is currently sustaining this, regardless of how it originally started. This shift matters enormously in shared problems involving other people, a struggling team, a strained family dynamic, a business partnership under pressure, because it moves the conversation away from assigning fault and toward jointly examining the actual interconnected structure everyone involved is operating inside of, which tends to produce far more productive, far less defensive conversations than a search for a single person or event to blame. You now hold 14 distinct tools, each one a different lens for cutting through a different kind of confusion. It is time to bring them together into a single, unified way of operating, because scattered tools, used individually and inconsistently, are far less powerful than the same tools integrated into one coherent approach to thinking itself. Chapter 15. Building Your Mental Model Toolkit. Thinking like a genius for the rest of your life. Think back to the very beginning of this, to that quiet moment right before every great breakthrough in history, the moment where someone facing an impossible problem decided to think about it differently, rather than simply harder. You now understand exactly what filled that moment for the sharpest thinkers throughout history. It was never a mysterious flash of raw genius arriving from nowhere. It was a specific tool, chosen deliberately from a well-stocked mental toolkit, applied precisely to the exact shape of the problem sitting in front of them. First, principles thinking. When an entire industry's assumptions needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Inversion. When the clearest path forward was found by mapping every path to failure and refusing to walk down any of them. Occam's razor. When a complicated, anxious story needed to be replaced with a simpler, more accurate one. Second-order thinking. When an obvious first answer needed to be tested 1, 2, 3 layers deeper before being trusted. 14 tools now sit available to you, each one built for a slightly different kind of problem. And the real work ahead of you is not memorizing them. It is learning to reach for the correct one instinctively, the way a skilled craftsman reaches for the correct tool without needing to consciously think through the entire toolbox first. Here is the honest truth about how this actually happens, because it will not happen automatically simply from having heard these ideas once. These models only become instinctive through deliberate, repeated practice, applied to real decisions in your actual life, not through passive familiarity gained from simply listening. Choose one model from everything you have just learned, whichever one felt most immediately relevant to a real problem currently sitting in your life, and apply it directly, today, to that specific problem. Not next week, not once you feel fully ready. Today, while the ideas are still fresh and specific in your mind. Write down the problem, apply the model's exact process, step by step, exactly as it was described, and follow it through to an actual decision or action. This single act of application will do more to install this model into your actual thinking than listening to this entire explanation 10 additional times over. Once that first model becomes comfortable, layer in a second one, and then a third, gradually building toward a genuine, practical toolkit, rather than attempting to master all 15 simultaneously, which tends to produce shallow familiarity with everything and genuine mastery of nothing. The goal is not to consciously run through a mental checklist of 15 named models every time a decision arrives. That would be slow and exhausting. The goal is to internalize these patterns of thinking deeply enough that they begin operating quietly in the background, the way an experienced driver no longer consciously thinks through each individual step of checking mirrors and adjusting speed, because the entire process has become instinctive through sustained, repeated practice over real miles driven, not through reading about driving technique a single time. It helps enormously to have a simple, practical way of matching a given situation to the right tool, rather than trying to hold all 15 models equally in mind at every single moment. When you feel stuck on a problem that seems to have no clear starting point, reach first for first principles thinking, stripping away inherited assumptions until you reach solid, foundational ground. When you are unsure which path forward is safest, reach for inversion, mapping the ways the situation could fail before mapping the ways it could succeed. When a situation feels more complicated and dramatic than it probably needs to be, reach for Occam's razor, testing the simplest explanation before reaching for something more elaborate. When a decision looks obviously correct at first glance, slow down and reach for second-order thinking, tracing the consequences at least 2 layers deeper before trusting that first impression. When you notice yourself holding an opinion with total, unquestioned certainty, reach for the map is not the territory, and ask what fresh evidence might be available to update that certainty. When you are tempted to weigh in confidently on something outside your genuine experience, reach for your circle of competence and decide honestly whether this is a moment for confident action or humble deference. When an outcome feels disappointing, reach for probabilistic thinking, separating the quality of your decision from the quality of the result it happened to produce. When a choice feels obviously worthwhile in isolation, reach for opportunity cost and ask what its true price actually is once compared honestly against the best available alternative. When someone's behavior stings and your mind rushes toward a story about their intentions, reach for Hanlon's razor and give the more likely, more human explanation a fair hearing first. When your effort feels scattered and your results feel underwhelming, reach for the Pareto principle and hunt recursively for the small cluster of activity actually driving your outcomes. When fear is quietly talking you out of a meaningful risk, reach for the regret minimization framework and ask the question from the honest distance of the end of your life. When comfort has started to feel suspiciously stagnant, reach for anti-fragility and introduce a small, deliberate dose of manageable difficulty on your own terms. When your confidence in a belief feels a little too smooth and a little too comfortable, reach for confirmation bias awareness and go hunting deliberately for the evidence that might prove you wrong. And when a problem keeps returning despite repeated individual fixes, reach for systems thinking and look for the loop sustaining it, rather than the single visible part that keeps taking the blame. None of these 15 tools was ever meant to operate in isolation, and the deepest thinkers throughout history rarely relied on just one at a time. The rocket entrepreneur who used first principles thinking to rebuild an entire industry from its raw materials was also, quietly, running an inversion analysis on every major risk before committing resources to it. The investor who built a fortune by respecting the edges of his circle of competence was also, simultaneously, running probabilistic thinking on every single position, weighing likely outcomes rather than chasing false certainty. These models overlap, reinforce, and strengthen each other constantly. And the more fluently you can move between them, depending on the exact shape of the problem in front of you, the closer you get to that quiet, decisive clarity that so many people mistake for an innate gift. when it was, this entire time, simply a trained, deliberate way of seeing. Remember the harsh, honest warning from the very beginning of everything you have just learned. Most people will hear these ideas, feel a spark of genuine recognition, and then return immediately to thinking exactly the way they always have, treating this as entertainment rather than training. 6 months from now, they will face the same categories of problems, using the same old patterns, wondering quietly why nothing in their thinking has actually changed. You were warned about this trap at the start for a reason, because now that the warning has been fully explained through 15 concrete examples, you have no excuse left to fall into it yourself. Genius was never a gift reserved for a fortunate few. It is a small collection of specific thinking habits, available to absolutely anyone willing to actually practice them on real problems, starting today rather than simply admiring them from a comfortable distance. The tools are now yours. What you build with them from this moment forward is entirely up to you.